Hi everyone, and a very warm welcome to this episode of the Learning Journeys podcast from Lacuna Learning. Thank you so much everyone for listening and subscribing, and we just hope you're all keeping really well just now. In today's episode, we are delighted to be joined by Royal Air Force fast jet pilot Matt. He's had this incredible journey over the last 15 years or so, and I'm just delighted that he's made the time to join us today. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I know Matt later on, so we'll just get straight into the conversation. Matt, thank you so much for making the time to come on the podcast.
Thanks for inviting me on, Doug. It's a pleasure.
So, aside from your exploits, flying very fast things, I'm aware that you've actually done a pretty decent amount of sport over the years, particularly stuff in the rivers and the mountains. I seem to remember you going on an expedition in Austria and one in Canada a few years back, as I remember. So, the question on the podcast we ask everybody, if you could go on an adventure anywhere in the world, where would you go? Who would you go with? And what would you do? There are no COVID restrictions for the purposes of the activity.
I'm glad to hear it. So, yeah, this is an interesting one. I think if I was to go anywhere in the world, it would be Antarctica. Mainly because actually I've been reading about that a lot recently. And it just seems like a really fascinating place to go. I know some people might say there's not a lot there, but it really is probably one of the last kind of real wildernesses and unexplored parts of the world. So I think if you're going to have an adventure anywhere, you probably have an adventure in Antarctica. On that, Michael Palin's book Erebus is highly recommended. That's one of the books I've been reading about it recently, and there's some fascinating stories about the exploration and discovery of the continent back at in the 1800s. So well worth a read. Who would I go with? Probably Tim Peake of all people. I think he'd be a good person to have along on an adventure expedition, and I think there'd be a lot to talk about that would interest me with him. So I think I'd go with him. And what would I do? I think if I could, I'd like to get onto the polar plateau, which I think would be an adventure in itself, because you've got to climb up a glacier, and it's about 10,000 feet is the altitude up in that plateau. So it's a heck of a climb to get up there. So I think that would be quite a challenge in itself. So that's probably what I'd like to do if I had the option of going on an adventure right now without any strings attached.
I mean, that was an incredible answer. I've asked that question like over 20 times now, and I'm always fascinated by what people really want to do. But Antarctica with Tim Peake is, you have set the bar very, very high indeed there, Matt. That's a pretty good one. A few people have copped out recently and said they'd just go around the world, which is a good answer, of course, but to say, no, I want to go there, and I know who I'd bring, but I also predict that you and Tim would have a lot to talk about, him being ex-military pilot and then flew to space. So, yeah, that is a conversation. Maybe we should get him on the pod, see if we get the two of you to have a conversation. That would be the dream, right? Okay.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, right. I'm excited to see where this goes now. It is incredibly hard to introduce Matt and to try and summarise your journey succinctly, so I'm going to let you do that for yourself in a moment. For the benefit of the listeners, Matt and I got to know each other during our time on the East of Scotland University's Air Squadron, where we were both studying full-time at different universities, but we're also members of the Royal Air Force as reservists, and we were learning to fly, organising, going on expeditions and all that kind of good stuff. As often happens at the end of university, our paths diverged, and you went off to join the Royal Air Force, and I went off to wear a tracksuit for a living and mess about in sport as far as I can see. So before we dive into your time in the Royal Air Force, and I can't wait to get into this a little bit more and explore a bit about what the current day job is, although it's not really a day job, right? Could you tell us a bit about your journey growing up in Lanarkshire and I guess your journey to this point and what that's been like for you a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So I guess growing up was fairly average childhood and everything. Good opportunities, good childhood, had a nice hometown to live in and grow up. So fortunate in that respect, and had plenty of opportunities for sports and I guess from a young age I was quite keen to push myself and compete in a sporting sense through long distance running and basketball and things. So I think I was encouraged to go for it and push myself. So that was probably definitely an early part of my upbringing, I think, which has had an impact throughout the rest of my life. So from Lanarkshire, went to university. After school, I went to university at St Andrews, which was a fantastic 4 years. Absolutely loved every minute of that experience. I met some great people. Obviously, I was on the University Air Squadron where I met yourself, Doug. Again, that was in itself fantastic experience. Never mind being at uni as well. So all around those 3 years were some of the best years, I think, in my life. It was a great location to be at university. And that's where I kind of got involved with the RAF. Well, I started flying prior to the RAF because I knew I wanted to be a pilot, whether it be a civilian pilot or a military pilot. So I started doing my pilot's license part-time while I was at school, worked in the weekends to pay for it, which meant that I didn't fly very regularly because it's not a cheap thing to do. But I persevered at that and then finally got my license in my first year at uni. And then I got involved with the University Air Squadron when I was at St Andrews. And that kind of got me involved with the RAF and introduced me to what could be offered by being involved with the military. I loved every minute of it. Had some great flying experience and, more importantly, I'd say some great adventurous training experiences. So going to Austria, as I think you mentioned, Doug, doing river kayaking and Klettersteigen, which is the same as Via Ferrata essentially, and some hill walking. What else did we do? We went to Canada on a wilderness sea kayaking expedition around British Columbia, which is probably one of the best things I've ever done in my life. And all these experiences really, I can tell and I can look back and I can see how each one of those experiences developed me as a person and changed me as a person and really opened my horizons significantly. So I really had to be grateful and thankful to the University Air Squadron for doing that, because I certainly think it's made me who I am today for sure. So that was my experience of that. And then from the UAS, having had all that insight and training with the RAF reserves, it was obviously a natural doorway into the RAF full time, which was a good option when I graduated, because it was at the time of the financial recession. So jobs were becoming scarce, particularly in the airline world for flying. So the Air Force was a great opportunity at that point.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. I mean, we could probably spend an hour just talking about the stuff that happened on that journey. We had a chat before the podcast about things that happened during those university years. I'm interested, before we dive into the Royal Air Force, I guess, training pipeline for pilots, I'm just dead interested. You talked about how the University Air Squadron and the adventurous training and the flying training, but I got this sense that it gave you something you didn't already have, and I'm wondering if you can put your finger on that maybe a little bit. What was it that those experiences gave you that you didn't have when you walked in the door, I guess, day one?
I think what they did was put me out of my comfort zone, doing stuff that I never thought I would probably do, but innately I would want to have done them, but perhaps I didn't feel I could or ever would. So it gave me those opportunities to go and do adventurous stuff, because I always had quite an adventurous kind of, always throughout my life, always been quite an adventurous person. And I think it just gave me the opportunity to go out and do things that I never thought I'd really do, and put me in positions that were outside my comfort zone for definite. And I think the growth that occurs when you're outside your comfort zone is really important. And I think that's what it did. It just unlocked things in me that I probably didn't think I had or could do. And I guess gave me a confidence to be able to do things and push myself and go for things perhaps that maybe I wouldn't have otherwise.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that, isn't it? Those experiences, and it's fascinating. On the podcast, I've had some amazing guests on, and the one that makes me laugh when you were talking there is Robbie Phillips, who's a professional climber, so he does for a living. And Robbie shared a trade secret, which is that he actually hates camping, and he actually doesn't really like being cold and wet, and he tolerates it as part of his job, right? But he just doesn't really love it. But he also recognises that it leads to growth. It's a struggle, but it's something worth doing. So it's interesting that you talk about, without those experiences and opportunities, you might not have had that confidence to push yourself maybe a bit and to grow. Which of course would have been really important when you started the training pipeline. Now, for the benefit of our listeners who are not familiar with the incredibly long and complicated training pipeline, I wonder if you could talk people through what that's like and maybe a wee bit about your experience of going through it.
Yeah, so the training to become a RAF fast jet pilot is well known to be hard work and pretty intense experience, and it's a long training system as well. So it took over 8 years for me to go from joining the RAF after university to being fully qualified on the Eurofighter Typhoon. And in that time, yes, there were gaps in my training where I held and did some other jobs for 2 or 3 years while waiting for slots to appear in the training system. But even with that, it's still a long and intense time. So you start off doing your basic officer training, where you do all your sort of basic military skills and discipline and field skills to a fairly basic level, just to make sure that everyone's at that same baseline military standard. And it's their chance to give you a hard time and give you inspections without notice and pick you up for your shoes not being shiny enough. All the usual kind of things you see in the film is what that sort of initial phase is like. So it's not very pleasant, but you just have to roll with it and expect that is exactly how it's going to be. And it can be quite fun and amusing as well at times. So after that, you then go into sort of leadership exercises and then more into academics about air power, how it applies to the modern world, and how the RF utilises it. So it becomes a bit more theoretical and academic as you progress. And then you have some sort of final leadership exercises where they assess your leadership skills and what you've learned. So that's about 7 months, and then you go on to your ground training for flying if you're going in as a pilot, and that's again about 2 months of academics to understand all the various subjects that you need to be familiar with for flying. So aerodynamics, rules and regulations, meteorology, navigation, aircraft instruments and systems, all these sort of topics which are clearly critical to be able to safely operate aircraft. Once that's complete and you've passed your ground school exams, you then go on to your elementary flying training, which is on a light aircraft with a propeller. So just like the sort of light aircraft you'll see from little flying clubs near hometowns, for example, Cessnas and things, a similar kind of aircraft type, but more maneuverable and aerobatic, so you can do aerobatic maneuvers and formation flying, so a little bit more advanced than your average light aircraft trainer. So you do about 9 months on that, learning to fly. So that's the basic flying skills. This is how you fly the aircraft, and it takes you from someone off the street that's never flown before to someone that can safely fly the aircraft on their own and make the right decisions and handle the aircraft correctly and deal with the emergencies. And that's your first building block to then progress. So while you're doing this, you're also being constantly assessed on your ability as a pilot. So it always breaks down into two things really. So your aircraft handling, so how good are you actually just physically flying the aircraft, but then probably of equal, if not more importance, is your airmanship, which is your decision making. So making the right decisions to make sure that you operate that aircraft effectively and safely and efficiently to get the task completed. And that's a really big thing. And the key thing about this airmanship really is experience. So the only way for that to develop is for you to fly as much as you can and see different scenarios. And this is just a constant thing that throughout your career you'll have to do and build up that bank of experience so that your decision making and airmanship will be as best as it can be. So during this time, as I said, you're being assessed throughout, and at the end of the course, you will be what's called streamed. So this is where they decide whether you're going to go to fast jets, helicopters, which is called rotary wing, or onto multi-engine. So generally, those that have the best scores will go fast jets because it's the most demanding, arguably, of the three streams, given the nature of the job that you do as a fast jet pilot. But again, it can just depend on who is required where. So if they need loads of fast jet pilots, more people go fast jets. If they don't need so many, then more people will go onto the helicopters or onto the transport aircraft. So it really depends on a lot of factors, but generally, the better you do, the more likely you are to get jets. So after that, you then get onto basic fast jet training, which will be on a turboprop aircraft, which was the Tucano, and is now the Texan. And that's just a bigger aircraft, more complicated, bigger engine with more complicated engine types. There's more systems to manage, and it's also twice the speed of what you were flying previously. So everything's now happening twice as fast as it had previously. And you develop your skills from what you learnt during your elementary flying. So all your basic navigation, formation flying, aerobatics all get built upon, and you start to do things that are now focusing more towards what you'll do on a jet, more tactical kind of focus stuff. So low-level navigation and target runs and leading formations, so that you're now getting all that kind of experience building up to be ready to go onto the jets. So that's then again about 18 months of training. Again, every trip is assessed. It's just, as I say, getting harder and harder as you go along. When you have successfully completed that phase, then you're then on to your first jet, which is the Hawk T2, based at RAF Valley. And that's, again, the speed is doubled yet again. And the complexity of the aircraft, again, is increased significantly. And you now have a jet engine as opposed to a propeller engine, whether that be piston or the turboprop on the Texan. Again, it's just building upon your experiences and increasing the complexity, increasing the difficulty, and it's now really getting focused onto what you'll do to fly that jet operationally to prepare you for the front line, where you're going to be using the aircraft in a fighting role as opposed to just flying around. So again, the course initially introduce you to jets and how you fly the jets. So you do all the basic handling of that. Then the second part of the course is how you fight the jets. So you do air combat, beyond visual range air combat, within visual range air combat, weaponeering for air-to-surface attacks, close air support where you're protecting troops on the ground, for example. So it all becomes a lot more tactically focused. So you're learning the very basics of the skills that you'll then have to go and use on the front line. Again, everything's assessed. So you have constant pressure of assessment throughout, and the difficulty is massively increased at this point compared to anything you've done before. So it's quite a difficult learning curve. After you then successfully complete Valley, you'll then go on to an operational conversion unit for the specific type of jet that you'll be flying operationally. So at the moment, you've got either the F-35 Lightning II, which is the vertical takeoff and landing Harrier replacement that some people will be familiar with, or the Eurofighter Typhoon, which is the other fast jet that we have at the moment, which is what I went on to. And the OCU is typically 6 months to a year, and that's training you on all the specifics of that aircraft and how you tactically use that aircraft as you would for real. So rather than it all being fairly generic as it would be on the Hawk, this is now specific tactics and procedures about how you're going to use that aircraft as a weapons platform and how you're going to fight that jet for real. So the speed hasn't increased, but the complexity, again, has increased significantly, not just in the systems, but in the procedures that you now need to be completely familiar with and able to execute to a good standard. So this is another stage where you're assessed at every trip and you have to meet the standard. And you really need to make sure you're on top of things so that when you leave that conversion unit onto your frontline squadron, you're able to arrive at the squadron and start to be a productive operational pilot. Having said that, when you arrive in the frontline squadron, you then have a combat ready workup to do, which again can take anything up to 6 to 9 months, and that's where you get even more focused tactical training to become a combat ready wingman. So the training never really stops. Once you've got more experience as a wingman, you then get trained to be a two-ship leader. So you're now leading a formation, and then you can go on to be a four-ship leader, go on to be an instructor. And so as you can see, it's just a continual training system that never ends. The pressure does ease somewhat when you get onto your frontline squadron. However, you're still having to meet a certain standard. So you're constantly under assessment, and this is kind of the biggest thing to take away, I'd say, from the training pipeline, is that you can never get to a point where you think you've made it and that's it. You constantly need to keep on top of your game and be able to cope with and manage the pressures of that training system for probably as long as you're in your career. I guess similar to medical training, where you're constantly having to train and study for the next qualification or the next posting until you become a consultant, for example. So it's probably comparable to that, but a very different field altogether. And it certainly takes a lot of resilience, determination, and fortitude, I'd say, to cope with that. And sometimes, I must admit, I haven't coped with it as well as I'd have liked, and it's been a real struggle. So yeah, it's not an easy job by any means, but interesting one.
Yeah, it certainly is, which now negates the need for me to ask you what the day job is, because everybody knows what the day job is. I want to ask you some questions about that, but before I do that, for the benefit of the listeners, so you talked about the speed of the aircraft doubling, basically every time you go on. By the time you get to frontline Typhoon, what sort of speeds are we flying at? Sure,
so if you're doing sort of low-level navigation attacks, you're generally 420 20 knots, so 7 miles a minute. And then when you're doing sort of beyond visual range or air-to-air combat within visual range, then you're looking at supersonic speed. So Mach 1.2 to 1.5 can be the jet can go up to Mach 1.8, so 1.8 times the speed of sound, which is very fast.
Very fast,
as
indeed.
you can imagine. Yeah. So it's all relative, however. So when you're at altitude flying at supersonic speeds, then you kind of don't notice it. It's when you're down low to the ground that you might not be flying as fast, but you get the feeling of the speed as all the details going past so much faster, and you have that much more clarity on everything around you and the perspective of the speed when you're low down.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to provide some scale for the listeners there, because it can all become a bit meaningless. It's like when astronomers talk about, light years and stuff, and it's a bit meaningless on most of us. So 7 miles a minute at low level sounds pretty quick. If you imagine, 7 miles in your car and doing that in 60 seconds, that gives you a sense of it. You talked about the resilience needed to get through that training. I'm just really interested, because I want to move on to something else in a second that we've chatted about before this. What were some of the skills and strategies that you drew upon? I guess I want to say to thrive, but it probably sounds a bit more like survive that pretty brutal training process. Well, what were some of the things that you used that helped you to make it through that very long and challenging process?
So I think for me, I felt I managed to cope with the pressure if I felt prepared, which kind of sounds a bit of a silly thing to say, but I used to put a lot of effort into all my preparation for each trip and do a lot of visualization. So almost visualize the whole flight, from starting the engines to flying the mission to landing and shutting the aircraft down. I used to visualize the whole thing in my mind's eye, as I'm sure a lot of the listeners will be familiar with visualization techniques. And that used to really, really help me with feeling prepared for the next trip that I would have to fly. In addition to that, I would also write up a lot of notes from everything I'd learned from that mission. So I'd usually write 2 or 3 pages of A4 of notes from all the things that I did well and all the things that I didn't do well at, to make sure that I had a record of what to refresh myself on and what I learned for the next mission, so not to make the same mistakes, and also to build on things that went well. So that took a lot of time and focus to do that for so long. But I think that certainly helped. And I think as the pressure became increased and the difficulty started to increase, I started to struggle with that and maintaining my composure at times. And I really had to start to look at ways of managing that. So a book I highly recommend and that really helped is called The Pressure Principle by Dr. David Aldridge. That really helped with how to control your breathing, get yourself in the right mindset, the whole inner dialogue to yourself, how big a difference that makes. And there's some key lessons from that book which I really applied through my flying training, which I think made a difference and certainly got me through the times where I was really feeling the pressure to manage the stress. And that certainly worked for the short-term immediate stress of the missions, because it would be very easy to get worked up. And even nowadays, I still get really nervous before some flights and missions. And I still use the same techniques that I was given by this book to manage that. I think in the longer term, because of the long-term pressure, which can clearly have an effect and get to you after a while, those techniques aren't really as applicable, because they're for the kind of heat of the moment or prior to the mission. But for the longer term, I got into probably reading about, I guess, as philosophy, Stoic techniques to reframe things. And that really helped as well. So it sounds a bit unusual, but I think some people may be familiar with how Stoic philosophy has had this resurgence, and a lot of the principles from that are really helpful to deal with difficult scenarios and how to persevere in difficult circumstances by just reframing things and focusing on what you have control over, for example, is a big part of it. So that really helped the longer term pressures and uncertainty that comes with being in this job and being away from home for a long time, for example, and being put in difficult situations. Yeah.
Thanks, Matt. I think it's really reassuring for the listeners at home that, Matt has been doing this for 15 years now, and he is a frontline fast jet pilot, operationally deployed, and he still gets nervous. So if there's athletes listening at home, or even coaches as well, very reassuring that even at that point of events, and Olympians talk about this as well, but you get to that front end, you still get nervous and it's still a struggle. It's never like you suddenly reach a point where everything's easy because you do everything better. Like it's like running, you just run faster. It never gets easier. So I find that quite reassuring that even after all this stuff that Matt's been through, he still gets nervous sometimes. You talked a bit about, when you get to the front line and, you're being deployed and it's dark and it's fast and things are going on and, things don't always work. You need to kind of draw upon some of the training, some of those reserves and some of those techniques. I'm wondering if you're allowed to tell us, because there are some things I'm being very careful I'm not allowed to ask you about. If you can tell us a bit about maybe times when you've had to do that on the front line.
Yeah, of course. So I think the one that sticks out in my mind was my first ever operational mission. So been through all the training for 8 or 9 years. I've got combat ready on the front line on the Typhoon, and I'm on my first deployment overseas, about to go on my first operational mission over a fairly nasty part of the world where there's some pretty horrible stuff going on the ground to try and help out people we were supporting out there. And the night before that mission, I really struggled to sleep. It was a mixture of real anxiety, not because necessarily of what was going on, but because I wanted to make sure I did well. I didn't want to screw up in my first mission, and I didn't want to end up on the ground somewhere that I definitely didn't want to be. So a mixture of the anxiety, but also a mixture of excitement because I'd spent a long time training for this, and this was finally me getting to do the job for real. And so, I can't say I got much sleep that night, but I think that's probably natural. I think I remember feeling pretty much the same way the next morning, and making a real mental effort to try and stay focused and calm my nerves and make sure that I was going to be ready to perform. And I think when I got strapped into the jet, I kind of started to calm down because I was now just back into my routine of doing my checks, starting the jet up, going through all the usual procedures. And I was still pretty nervous as we flew out to where we're going. It's a good hour and a half, longer than that flight out to where we were, and we have to get fuel from the tanker, so conduct air-to-air refueling as part of that as well. And I really struggled initially to get conduct air-to-air refueling. It's really can be quite a difficult task in itself, but I hadn't really had any issues with it previously. But I was clearly still pretty nervous and a bit wired about the whole thing, and it took me quite a few attempts to finally make contact with the basket. So to put it into perspective, you have a fuel probe on the side of your jet which you deploy, and you have to try and get that into I think it's about 5 foot, if that, diameter basket, which it's on the end of a fuel hose, and you make contact with that, and that's how you then get fuel going into your tanks while you're airborne. So it involves close formation flying with a large airline aircraft, and then also really carefully coordinating and flying your fuel probe into this basket, which is moving about in the airflow and be bouncing all over the place with turbulence. So it's quite a demanding and delicate task to manage. But eventually I managed to make contact with the basket, get the fuel, and then after that was absolutely fine. I was just in the zone, ready to get on with things. So it took a lot of effort, and up to that point I think to really settle into it. And I was definitely using the sort of mental techniques of trying to control my breathing and keep positive dialogue and stay focused on what I was doing to manage the sort of the nerves and the pressure.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Just seeing, like, I guess for you, like, you do all this training, it's like such a long time. Like in sport, you might train for, like, Olympians for 4 years to then try and use the stuff you've trained for. But in your case, you'd train for like nearly a decade to learn to do this job. Are you able to talk about something else that happened on operations? Are we allowed to talk about this? Or is this a not for public discussion anymore?
Yeah. You're talking about the emergency I had
If you don't mind
not that
talking
long
about
ago.
it,
Yeah, of course, not a problem. Yeah. So it was night time. The weather wasn't great. Quite fatiguing when you're on nights as well, because you have night vision goggles on your helmet, and it's a lot of weight on your neck, and the missions can be several hours long, and you're landing late at night, etc. So it's quite a tiring and exhausting time. And it was on this one of these night missions where I started having various electrical issues with the aircraft. Just random things like the cockpit lighting went full brightness, which in itself doesn't sound like a big issue, but at night you really want all the lighting to be dimmed down to preserve your night vision as much as possible, so you can look out the cockpit and see what's going on in the outside environment a lot better. And that's particularly important when you're coming into land, for example. You need to see the runway lights, and if the cockpit lighting's at full brightness, you're going to it's going to really impair your vision. So and I haven't ever experienced that before. So there's various things like that happened, and external lighting started to fail. Lots of small, kind of not really associated issues started occurring that I'd never seen before or trained to. And this just slowly started to progress throughout the night. Initially, I wasn't too concerned. I was happy to prioritise the mission over the fact that I had these minor niggles going on with the aircraft, because I knew that what we were doing was important, and I didn't want to cut the mission short. But as the night progressed, eventually problems started to build on top of each other and become more frequent, and eventually got a warning caption suggesting that there could be an issue with one of the engines. Which was a lot more serious, and at that point the emergency cars would have me diverting to the nearest suitable airfield, which would be in the theatre of operations, so where we were flying around essentially. So at this point I now had a proper emergency to deal with, and I was a bit concerned that there potentially could be a fire causing all these random problems that just kept on building upon each other, and I had to take it a lot more seriously and conduct a single engine approach in the fairly bad weather with bad radios, so I could barely get any radio communication with the tactical control who were controlling us, and it was all quite emotional at times trying to manage the situation. But I kind of knew what I had to do. I knew that I was committed to having to divert and land somewhere where I didn't really want to be going into. So I knew that was the decision, and I just had to now make sure I got on with it properly. And my wingman was helpful. He conducted a visual inspection of the aircraft and helped with the radio relay. So we worked quite closely as a team to make sure that everything was covered and nothing was missed in the emergency drills. And then he acted as a relay so that the air traffic control were aware of what was going on. And then I managed to make a safe approach and landing where I needed to be. And then as I got the aircraft stopped and sort of settled down, I had to keep the power on for some time, the engines running for some time to cool the brakes, for example. And I then realised when I came to shut down that I couldn't get out the aircraft, that the canopy actuating system had failed as well. And that left me in a bit of a awkward position where I was at this unfamiliar airfield in the middle of the night on an exposed area of tarmac, which is not really where I wanted to be when I knew that there was a threat of rocket attacks, which is the whole reason we'd been there in the first place. I had the option of either ejecting the canopy, which would be quite aggressive and would mean that the canopy would be shooting off in rockets and go several hundred feet into the air and could potentially injure people on the ground or cause further damage. And furthermore, I'd be sitting with a load of rockets going off nearby my head, so I kind of wasn't keen on that option. The other option was to try and get the ground crew to actuate the canopy or get the canopy open using various other ways to try and solve the issue, but I was fairly confident it was not going to work. But I had to go through the process and try and communicate with them without any voice comms, how to try and get the canopy open from the outside, which didn't work. And then eventually I had to try and ask them if they had an angle grinder, and I had to then get them to cut a hole in the canopy to allow me to get out. And I'd been in the aircraft for quite a long time by now and was getting a bit fed up with the situation, and I just needed to get out that jet as all the power had died completely by this point. So yeah, it was all in all an interesting experience. Is probably the best way of putting it. And getting out the aircraft and finding yourself in this unfamiliar base in the middle of the night. I then had to put all the safety pins in all the weapons, which took like a good length of time, and try and make sure the jet was secure before then trying to make communication with my home base to find out what was going on next. So yeah, it was quite as I say, an interesting experience and a good way to test how all the training works and how effective it is when you have to actually carry out all these emergency drills for real. So yeah.
Wow. I'm just making sense of, like, I've known you for a pretty long time, and it feels like a really long way from, like, you first getting in an airplane for the first time and learning to fly this little light aircraft around the place to having to do all of that in the dark under pressure. And yeah, if you get it wrong, it's not like there's no reset button on this. Like when it goes wrong, it goes really wrong. So that's an amazing story. I always say this about this point in the podcast. I would just listen back to that story. I'm also struck though by something that, Matt, there's a parallel between you and Alex Honnold, who's known as No Big Deal, that you describe a really, really, really serious emergency as no big deal because you're trained to do it. You just get on with business, right? And there's a lesson in there for all of us. I'm dead interested in this final part of the podcast, just to explore a bit about how you make sense of these things. So I guess in two parts, really. One is like on a personal level, like emotionally, how do you make sense of that night and other nights and things that have happened? But also perhaps how do you, as a team, as a group, there's a lot of people listening to podcasts who are really interested in how we debrief. So I guess I'm interested, like, how do you personally and how do you like collectively make sense of things that happen in fast jets?
Sure, yeah. So I think the thing that I noticed probably most about the emergency was not so much my main concern was had I made the right decisions, and I was kind of going over the whole sequence of events in my head for quite a while afterwards, and making sure that I'd made the right choice and did everything as well as I could, because all these things get scrutinized and reviewed after the events, and so you know if you've made mistakes, they will get picked up. You're not going to get punished for them, but it'll be noted and lessons learned from it. So I think that was probably my main concern, was like, first of all, okay, make sure everything's safe, and then did I do everything correctly? And it took a while for me to be satisfied that I did everything I could and as well as I could. So I was content that that was that put to bed. The other factor, I think, was after I got back, I was put into COVID isolation because this was in the height of COVID-19. So I think the thing that was more difficult was the lack of communication with back home. So unable to let them know what happened or where I was or anything. And then when I got back, I was then in isolation away from my squadron colleagues. And that was difficult, having had that experience, to then be put into isolation for some time. So that was gave me time to think, but also quite unpleasant because you're quite tight-knit as a squadron. And I kind of felt like I wanted to talk it through with people and things, and didn't really have the option. So that was the thing I'd say I noticed most from that. As far as debrief is concerned, I think this is something we do for everything. We debrief everything because you need to really make sure that every hour of flying, every hour of training you do, you get the maximum value out of it, because it's an expensive business to fly jets, and it's a complicated business, so you want to make sure you get maximum value out of it. So for debriefing, we typically will debrief for anything between 3 to 6 hours post missions, depending on what level you're at, to get all the lessons out. And it can be quite laborious, it can be quite tedious, and it can be quite painful, depending on how well the mission went. So it's important, though, to make sure that as collectively you learn from each other, and you can draw out those lessons for others as well. So typically we'll debrief ourselves and debrief other people within the same formation, and other people will own up to their own mistakes, and you need to be able to pick up on their mistakes and give an instructional fix to how to do things differently or better the next time. And I think the most important thing for debriefing is you need to just be honest with yourself and own your own mistakes and bring them up, and not try and hide behind things or hide them, because it never works, because everything you do is recorded and on tapes. You need to own up to your mistakes, and if you have a point for someone else, you need to just make sure you present it in a way that is fair and non-judgmental, and in a professional way that then people can learn from that error. But ultimately, I think the most important thing is just to own your mistakes and be humble about it, and take it for what it is, which is that you're trying to learn to be better, and that you're going to make mistakes. There's going to be errors. There's going to be things where you're not going to make the standard potentially, and it's just really important that you accept that that's the whole point of what you're doing, is to get better and try and stay focused and get the most from that debrief, because of the amount of time and effort and money that's been invested into it. So that's the most important thing, I think, about debriefing.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. That's fascinating. I want to ask you one question on that before we get to the final bit of the podcast. And I attempt to try and summarize this as just unbelievable conversation. Yeah, so I remember this from my brief time in the Air Force, doing like one I remember the most clearly was a first formation flight, solo flight. And one of the things I think is really interesting, I think the world of sport could learn from, is that when we did that debrief, there was an instructor in an aircraft with a student, and there was 2 students in the aircraft on their own, and I was one of those students. And some things had happened. It hadn't gone quite to plan, which is just what happens, right? And this business of you need to be honest and say stuff you could have done better, and I was pretty open about that. But actually, I needed to hold one of the instructors to account on what they had done or not done and how they'd handled that and so on. And I remember that, although they didn't really want to hear what I had to say, they also welcomed it and said, well, actually, this is how we learn. This is how we get better. And I just find that really fascinating. You don't, and I think in sport we're often quite equitable. It's generally quite flat profiles, but not always. Quite often it's the coach enlightening everybody else, and maybe we need to hold the coach to account. Maybe they aren't as good as they needed to be today. But I remember that in that instant, actually, the squadron boss spoke to me afterwards and said, yeah, you were quite right to disagree with him. He's a much more experienced pilot than you, so he's coming from a different place. But actually, you made some really good points, and it was almost encouraged. I guess my question for you, maybe you've already answered it with the honesty and the kind of candor or kind of psychological safety. Where do you think that comes from, that environment or that climate where junior pilots feel able to challenge squadron bosses and everything in between? Because we have ranks and hierarchies in the military. Where do you think that real honesty and vulnerability comes from?
So yeah, it's a bit odd because in the military, as you say, you have like a very strict hierarchy, which depends on what arm of the military you're in. Certainly the army, I think, is very, very strict hierarchy. The RAF is less so, just by the nature of the sort of work that the RAF does and how it's highly technical, for example. But I think the way this is the kind of culture where you can not criticize, but you can question things and you can debrief and raise points to people that are more senior to you or are more experienced than you. It comes down to when you are in that formation debrief, when the door shuts in that debriefing room, you do the time hack, you state the formation call sign. Everybody in that room is just a formation number. So you don't refer to people by rank, you don't refer to people by name. They're 1, 2, 3, or 4. And that is the level playing field. And whoever is -1, so the flight lead, is the guy that is owning the formation and owning that brief, and then owning the debrief. And yeah, they can be challenged or questioned if there's something that's incorrect. That's completely acceptable. But ultimately, it could be a junior pilot that's the 2-ship lead or the 4-ship lead that is leading the squadron boss, and they need to be able to debrief the squadron boss on their flying and their tactical execution points, so that everyone in the room can learn. And this is why you can have like a junior wingman who picks up something or has read something that perhaps the more experienced people just haven't looked at in a long time. And because this junior wingman has just been when I say wingman, that's just a term. It could be a girl as well. We've got plenty of female pilots in RAF as well, but wingman's a term that's used. So they could be having just read something recently because they're studying to learn about how to become combat ready. They've picked up something that has been forgotten about by the people that haven't read that document for several years, potentially, because they've got other things to be focusing on and learning about. So that's a really good environment. And I'd say it generally works well, but it is also slightly personality driven. So depending on who the boss is or who the instructor is or the flight lead is will kind of set the tone for the debrief and the brief. But the very best instructors and flight leads are those that maintain a very professional debrief or brief, and but are also humble enough to be able to criticize themselves or to pick up their own points, and also accept any points from the floor. But they also need to be able to speak to those that are higher ranking than them and be able to train them as well, because that's a really important part of the job, as you get some senior officers coming in who haven't flown the jet for very long and need to be trained up, and they need to be receptive to all the training as well. So it's a kind of a flat hierarchy, but whoever the flight leader instructor is will own that room and own that debrief.
Wow. There was like a lot in there. You could replace like seniors with coaches and all sorts of stuff there for sport. That was, yeah. Oh my goodness, everyone, listen back to that. Like, this is just, there was so much in there. I love this idea of, we have hierarchies, but not in debriefs, this kind of culture where you're allowed to question and critique, and it's kind of made okay. And I just love that, like, yeah, the rank is irrelevant. When the door shuts, whoever was leading it regardless. And I love this idea that actually it sounds to me like a lot of it is about learning, and that the learning is what drives the agenda a little bit. I'm going to do this really difficult thing now, Matt. I'm going to try and summarize this unbelievable conversation. So here we go. So you started out, you started out by saying you're going to go to Antarctica. Pretty cool. Let's just not forget that for a moment. This really, really humble, we talked about this a lot today, this really humble upbringing and humble start to what you did, and just this maybe sense of doing stuff you didn't think you could do, or things you didn't think you could do. University air squads and stuff, like unlocking stuff in you, potential, and maybe giving you some confidence that, you were more able than you maybe thought you were. Yeah, going through we talked about this on a different podcast, which I'll link to, the pressure bubble of training, and this idea of being assessed all the time. But this idea of, like, a lot of it's about decision making. You're building up this bank of experience, so the more scenarios we can show you, the more we can do that. Things become more tactically focused as we go through the system. And I love this idea you talked about, this training system where you never get to the point where you think you've made it, because there's always something else to learn, or something else to do, or another way of thinking about it. I think it's a really nice idea. You talked about how you coped with that, so that you generally said that you coped best when you felt prepared. So you did lots of visualization, you took literally reams and reams of notes after everything you did, and it sounds this real professionalism for you started like quite early on in your career. It was reassuring to hear that even professional frontline pilots still get nervous when they do what they do. You told this incredible story about you in this really serious emergency situation on the front line, and how you cope with that, and then do that. Then we talked a bit about how we debrief and kind of how we make sense of that. My final question for you, and I hope this is more of a discussion point for people that listen to the podcast and come back and have a chat with me about it, because I'm interested. Given everything you've learned, from the world of aviation, but particularly the world of fast jet flying, what do you think performance sport can learn from the world of fast jet flying and aviation?
So I think there's a big crossover between performance sport and military aviation, and quite a lot of the books I've read have kind of alluded to this fact. And I think there's definitely a lot of transferable skills between the two things. I guess the big difference is that performance sport, it's very physical, but compared to fast jet flying, however, there's a physical element to that as well. But I'd say, regardless of how physical it is, I think it all comes down to, as I'm preaching to the converted here, but it all comes down to your mental game, I think. And that is something that performance sport and aviation and military aviation really share. I think for the one thing that coaching of elite performance sport could take away is probably, I think there's a lot to be said for how the debriefing style works and the effort that goes into that. As I said, it can be very painful, and you can spend significantly more hours debriefing for even just a 1 or 2 hour mission, but going through everything in slow time, and you'll see things that you didn't even potentially were aware of doing at the time, which is so important, because when you're in the heat of the moment and there's a million things to think about and you're focused on the task at hand, you always have the opportunity to take that step back and see the bigger picture, or see exactly how what you're doing is affecting the wider scenario. So I think taking the effort to really debrief everything in detail will always be a good thing to do, no matter how tedious or painful it may seem at the time. And you need to just be focused for that debrief and take notes and reflect upon it. And then the next day you'll come back and you'll do better. You'll definitely do something better or differently than you did before. So I think that whole debriefing culture is really, really vital.
Thanks, Matt. I've written down a lot there. Yeah. The mental game, super important. We probably need to spend a bit more time thinking about that sometimes. And this business of debriefing. There's some real parallels. Like my day job's in canoeing, and like whitewater time, for example, like down at Lee Valley in London, it's unbelievably expensive. And so, yeah, I'll be really spending the time to debrief on that. Sports like skeleton bobsled, you get one shot on that track, or do you know what I mean? Like, can we maybe be more disciplined and more professional about how we try and extract learning from that? Matt, thank you so much. That was an absolute joy, and I hope people listen to that and listen again to it, because there's just so much in there, and you're a great storyteller as well, so thank you very much. Folks, I hope you had books out for this one. I hope you took loads of notes. Feel free to come back to me, have a conversation with me about it. Anything that you picked up on, you want to chat more about, please do so. Please keep an eye out for future podcasts and hit subscribe to never miss out. And everyone, in the meantime, please stay safe.